Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. With a huge public sector strike just days away, including calls for public disobedience from one union, warnings about patient safety from the Department of Health and concerns about children with special needs, I'll be discussing the planned action with a leading trade unionist. Also today, the controversy over how council funding for a charity moved from a recommended £800,000 to, at one point, barely £30,000 with no explanation as to why. Plus, the first in our series of people on the front line helping those most in need and what they make of the political stalemate.
The gratitude on the faces of the parents, it was sad. I was sad that this is what we're reduced to.
And with his thoughts on where we are, the Northern Ireland editor of the Belfast Telegraph and the Sunday Independent, Sam McBride. The scale of the strike planned for this Thursday is becoming clear. Upwards of 150,000 public sector workers are expected to take part, along with the union's condemnation of the Secretary of State for not passing on funding from Westminster for pay deals. Come new calls for public disobedience, but also new warnings about patient safety and concerns about special needs children if the walkout goes ahead. Gerry Murphy, Assistant General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, is with me now in the studio. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. Let's just take those points one by one if we can. There's a well-rehearsed case for the DUP to be put under the spotlight on this issue, yet you seem to be persisting with trying to put pressure on the one man who doesn't need a single vote in Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State. Why that strategy?
Well, in effect, Mark, the local politicians are irrelevant at this point as far as the trade union movement is concerned.
Are they irrelevant? Because, of course, the reason we don't have Stormont and the reason these pay deals can't be delivered is because the DUP is continuing to boycott Stormont. So why is the DUP not in your sights?
As things stand, Mark, we are trade unionists. Our job here is to negotiate with the people who hold the purse strings, and the person holding the purse strings at this point in time is the Secretary of State, not the Democratic Unionist Party, who have chose to absent themselves from the executive. Therefore, we're directing our fire, as you describe it, at Chris Heaton-Harris because he's the man who has the power. He's the man who came out in that week before Christmas at Hillsborough, stood in front of the microphones and confirmed what we all knew, that he had the money available to him and that the workers in our public services deserved to be paid.
Yeah,
now
and there's
£3.3
billion package sitting there on the table at the disposal of a new executive if and when one is put in place. £600 million of that for public sector pay deals. But the reason that's not coming through is because the DUP is saying that it's not going back in because of its position on an Irish sea border. So that surely should be the point that you are making. Chris Heaton-Harris says his hands are tied. This deal, this £600 million, is tied into the devolution project, he says.
I've heard what he said. I don't believe him, and neither does anybody else. He said it's available. He should release it now, put it in the hands of the civil servants and let the negotiations commence with the representatives of the workers across our public services, and let's get order restored here and stability across the public services.
Can I ask you about Sinn Féin's motion for the recall of the Assembly on Wednesday? Is that going to muddy the waters? Because it's clearly putting the blame on the DUP for the current state of play. Is what Sinn Féin has done, in your view, helpful or unhelpful?
I think it's helpful if it gets the executive up and running. We need an executive up and running. Of course we do. We need it up and running, in particular in respect to public services, to restore some stability. So if the motion helps in that respect, then it's helpful.
But you just conceded the point that getting the executive up and running again is essential. But you began the interview by saying that that's not what your focus is.
No, my initial remarks were around the fact that the politicians, due to the fact that the Democratic Unionist Party have taken themselves out of the executive, mean that, power rests with the Secretary of State.
OK. Well, we'll see how he responds to this. He says his hands are tied and that there's nothing he can do under the current circumstances. Can we talk about NIPS's call for public disobedience? What does it mean, and does the ICTU endorse it?
Well, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is the umbrella body for 26 unions across the north, of which NIPSA is one, a large one, but it is one. What the Irish Congress of Trade Unions does is represent the collective views of 26 trade unions. NIPSA are a sovereign trade union, they're entitled to hold their view. Their call for civil disobedience is a matter for them. What will happen with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions going forward here is after Thursday we will sit down and evaluate where we are then, and then collectively reach a decision on how we proceed.
Okay, so Patrick Mulholland, in fact, in an interview with Sam, said if you have to block a road, you're within your legal rights to do it. If you have to occupy a building to make a point, occupy a building to make that point. I just want to be absolutely clear. Are you saying that the idea of public disobedience is a good idea or not a good idea?
What I'm saying is that those views that you're after expressing are the views of NIPSA. They're not the views of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions at this time.
So you're not endorsing them?
I'm not endorsing them at the moment. I represent the views of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, 26 unions, not one.
Yeah, but are you actively saying they are unhelpful? Are you going so far as to say they're unhelpful? Could they be a distraction to what's going to happen on Thursday? I suppose that's my point.
Well, I don't think that going forward, indicating at this point what we are planning or what we're thinking of doing in the event that we are unsuccessful, and we're not planning to be unsuccessful here, we're planning to be successful. We believe that the actions that we are taking are having an effect. What's taking place on Monday, we think, is partly at least influenced by the fact that the strike is taking place on Thursday. So I don't believe that Patrick Mulholland was attempting to be unhelpful. I think Patrick Mulholland was indeed articulating the genuine views of his membership and the concerns and frustration which is rising across the trade union movement.
I'm sure we'll hear more about that as the week unfolds towards the action on Thursday. We need to talk about the issue of patients in hospitals who may be affected by this, and also children with special needs, because we know that some parents and some of those involved in caring for those children have said they have real concerns. Should special efforts be made to provide the derogations that are necessary to make sure that patients in hospitals and children with special needs are impacted as little as possible on Thursday?
I believe, Mark, that efforts to do that are already underway. There are existing processes between the employers and the trade unions around the putting in place of derogations to prevent unnecessary and harmful, if you like, complications arising as a consequence of strikes and industrial action as a whole. Those processes, as I've said, are in place. I understand that discussions are taking place between certain employers and certain trade unions. I would imagine that, as has happened in the past, they will reach arrangements to prevent significant amounts of harm taking place, but also to put in place emergency processes and procedures to allow levels of service provision to be maintained in some areas.
Okay, so you sound sympathetic to that argument, and we should watch this space to see how that rolls out in the next few days. You would want as little disruption for those critical people as possible, is effectively what you're saying.
What I'm saying here is that, yes, we would want as little disruption for those critical, for those who require emergency support as possible.
Okay, well, that's very clear. Jerry Murphy from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us. Sam McBride has been listening to that. Sam, what do you make of what you've just heard, first of all, in terms of the justification for the focus being on Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State, as opposed to the DUP?
I'm not surprised by it because it backs up what other people in other unions have been saying to me over recent days. There's a very clear focus here. I was slightly surprised when I first heard this, but it's very clear that what Chris Heaton-Harris did in December has enraged people in the public sector. He was seen by them to wave money in front of them and say to them, you will get this if the DUP DUP do what I want. And those people can't control what the DUP does. And so therefore that has been a really bungled attempt by the Secretary of State to get the DUP over the line. If it had worked, it would have been great from his perspective. Now that it hasn't worked, it's come back to bite him.
What about the issue of calls for public disobedience? I mentioned that quote that you wrote up in the Belfast Telegraph yesterday from Patrick Mulholland, NIPS's Deputy General Secretary. We didn't hear, let's just say, a ringing endorsement from Gerry Murphy just now.
No, and some of the unions who are involved in this are not militant. They have maybe not been on strike for a very long time. I'm not sure if some of these unions have ever been on strike in a major way, as is happening on Thursday. So there's a fine line here for the union movement to tread. They're trying to show to the people who are wanting massive, very disruptive action that they're taking this seriously, but they're wanting to keep on board these other people. I think what Gerry Murphy has said there is something which does manage to do that, but at some point that might not be possible. If you have people occupying buildings, blocking roads for significant lengths of time, there are other people who are members of trade unions who simply will not support that. But the hope from their perspective is that this is so disruptive, so unthinkable for the private sector as well as for the public sector. People won't get to work. They'll not be able to move around in some cases. Roads won't be gridded. This will be very, very economically disruptive, that there is no option but for the Secretary of State to step in and clear this up.
Yeah, because the numbers potentially involved are very significant. As I mentioned, there are 170,000 out of 220,000 public sector workers. That's almost 80%. I mean, if this goes ahead in the way that we're hearing at the moment it's going to go ahead, it's hard for anybody not to be impacted by it in some shape or form come Thursday.
It is astronomical. I think a lot of people in Northern Ireland don't grasp how significant this is going to be. There has not been a strike of this nature in the history of Northern Ireland, as far as I can find. The Ulster Workers' Council strike was not a strike in any conventional sense of the word. People were coerced, paramilitaries were involved. This is massive, and it is going to bring parts of Northern Ireland to a standstill.
OK, but you think that the Secretary of State may be forced to think about moving in some areas to avoid that kind of disruption? Is that what you're saying?
Ultimately, he does not want to instigate direct rule, so he's got an option here. He could pay the money for the public sector pay without going into full direct rule. He's already done this in all sorts of other areas. There's no principled point here by the Secretary of State. He sees that as leverage. He doesn't want to give that up. But if it's giving that up in exchange for keeping Northern Ireland functioning and keeping the economy functioning, that might be the lesser of two evils from his perspective, ultimately.
OK, well, we'll see what happens. Sam, we'll talk to you again later in the programme. Thanks very much indeed for now. Now, before we speak to the Chief Executive of SOLAS, the charity that found itself in the middle of a big Belfast City Council funding row last week, we've the first in a series of voices from the front line, people who are helping those most in need. We want to hear about the challenges they're facing in the current climate.
My name is Edmund Arafor, founder of Life Hub NI in Belfast. We focus on 100% fresh and nutritious food for families that can't feed themselves. Currently, we are feeding 450 adults. That's not counting partners and children. We have a waiting list that we can't tackle at the moment of an additionally, it was 250, it's gone up to 277 as at last Saturday. We chose to give Christmas presents to every one of their children, and we put 3 toys. We got 3 toys in every box. Now, the cheapest toy was £40. Now, the gratitude on the faces of the parents, it was sad. I was sad that this is what we're reduced to. We just have to dig deeper, appeal more, look for more support. We never give up knocking on doors of supermarkets or businesses to help us feed these people. We can't afford to give up, because where do they go? What is the alternative? We will never get to the point where we say, well, this is our quota and that's it. As long as there are people that are hungry out there, we will look for food to feed them. We're feeling a neglect. Their constituents, their voting public are being let down in a real dangerous way. If they don't step up, the next thing we'll be recording are deaths from food poverty. That will be a sad indictment on all of us as a nation.
That was Edmund Arrow4, and if you want to tell us how your organisation is working to help those most in need and the challenges you're facing, you can email us on bbcpoliticsni@bbc.co.uk. Let's move to SOLAS and its recent funding controversy. Some councillors at City Hall in Belfast recommended it get £800,000 towards a new building, but a committee of Sinn Féin and DUP councillors said it should just get £25,000. A huge drop which caused a big row and calls for a rethink. In a moment, we'll hear from the SOLAS Chief Executive. But first, here's a reminder of the story.
They've been fabulous. They've helped so much in every aspect you can think of. He comes home so happy. He looks forward to it. When SOLAS isn't on, it's a bad day.
Couldn't really fathom how you could move from first position, most priority, a highest priority project to the last position. Quite angry, I suppose, and annoyed that disability service had been overlooked in such a way.
I believe it's a carve-up. I believe that far too many of the financial decisions taken in City Hall are taken in corridors and in quiet corners.
I'm not sure what we would have done without SOLAS during this time. They took Oisín twice a week for 3-hour sessions, which allowed us parents to sleep and spend time with our other son. SOLAS literally stopped our family from falling apart.
They really, really need their building to make these goals a reality and give young people the therapy skills and human interaction that they need to go out and survive in the world. And just how much longer do our young people have to make do?
Look, it is a win. We're getting additional money into a charity that really, really needs that funding. I think it was unfortunate that they were pitted against other community groups, which never needed to happen.
Ultimately, we have to deliver for children and young people with disabilities. We have to deliver that building for them, and we're going to do it. So we'll take the 300, but we'll keep going back for more. It's the slice of the salami. Really, we have one little bit, but we'll keep slicing away at it. We'll keep coming back to here, and we'll keep trying to get our fair share for the children that we support.
Joan Henderson, the Chief Executive of SOLAS in Belfast City Hall. And after a very busy week, I'm pleased to say she joins me now in the studio. Welcome to you. Thanks very much for coming in to join us. Just want to recap. You thought you were getting £800,000. Then came the intervention from the rubber stamping committee where Sinn Féin and the DUP decided to reduce that to £25,000. Then there was a row about the council review into all of this being held behind closed doors, and you were there and you had to leave. And finally, you got the news that you were going to get £300,000. That was quite a roller coaster ride by any standards.
It certainly was. It certainly was. But I think, I suppose, in terms of where we are now, we're relieved, I suppose, in one sense that we have achieved something. That we're grateful, I suppose, you know, as the days have passed on and we've had such feedback, positive feedback all week from parents, from families, from the wider community. You know, we're, in essence, I think we're very lucky to have had that opportunity in many respects to put the children and young people with disabilities on the map. You know, it is an area that has been neglected for far too long by a whole range of services. And I really feel that this is an opportunity to make those changes now for people to actually, you know, but disability transcends all politics. Every politician there, and I said it the other night, every politician in that room will know somebody or will have a family member that has disabilities. And actually, this is too important not to have services and not to have the right facilities in our communities available to children with disabilities.
And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this would agree with you and would say that you're being very generous in the way that you're expressing yourself. I don't want to draw you into the nasty party politics that we sometimes see in Belfast City Hall, but would you say you are angry at the way in which those two main parties seemingly colluded behind closed doors to reduce your share of the pie in favour of other groups which perhaps for other reasons they felt they wanted to support?
I think it was very short-minded, or I suppose I don't think they really knew what they were doing and the impact that they would actually have had. I feel it is unfair. It would be unfair of me to reflect that there wasn't certainly a lot of parents in our in our services. They weren't very, very angry. I tend to think that we have to take a very measured approach on everything. There's always context to everything. But it's important, I think, to remember that there was courage shown by our parents who stood up there and addressed the council, and with very personal stories about how life was for them and is for them as a parent of a child with disability. It took a lot of courage for those smaller parties to be advocates, really strong advocates throughout the week and running up to that. And then eventually we saw courage through compromise by the big two parties, and that's welcome, and we are relieved that that is the case. But it took an awful lot of democracy, I suppose, to happen, and a big public outroar for that to happen.
Well, an awful lot of pressure, and it must be exhausting for you and for the parents who were involved in making that case repeatedly over the past week. I need to ask you about these numbers. £800,000 seems like a lot of money, and I'm sure you could have done a lot with that. £300,000 is still a lot of money. But can you do what you want to do with less than half of the money you thought you were getting?
No, is the short answer. When I was going to school, 40% was a pass mark, and we've got 38.5% of what we had asked for. So we've a long way still to go. However, other opportunities have opened up. We have a Leveling Up opportunity, a funding it's in where we've always considered that we would be applying for that fund. We just expedite that process now, and we're throwing every single resource we have to try and ensure that we get that particular fund and get access to that fund. And we will need all party support for that. And as I said before, politics transcends everything. So disability transcends all of politics, and therefore we need all of our politicians to be back on those sort of initiatives.
But what it does do is drain your resources, sap your energy, because you've now got to really grasp the fundraising nettle again, when you could have been putting your efforts into actually building the building that you thought you had the money for. It is a distraction, and presumably it will slow the process of this project up.
Yeah, it is a distraction without doubt, but we have people power behind us. We have so many offers of help this week. It is unbelievable, and apologies to people that we haven't been able to get back to yet. We will start to, coalesce all those people together, bring that about, and that people power will actually bring about this building. And this building will actually be a lot more valuable to people when everybody has bought into it in that way. So as much as it is a bad story, it's a good news story in other ways. And yes, it's a distraction, but we're very hopeful. We have to stay on track. We're always about children and young people with disabilities and the families. We stay focused on that, and we bring people with us on our way. And I'm so delighted that we have so many people now on our way, behind us, supporting us in our community, that know what we're about now and are more than willing and happy to put their time and support into it.
It does seem that you're being very magnanimous, and it looks like you've got the moral high ground in all of this. Do you think that our councillors, who you described a moment or two ago as not really knowing what they were doing, might learn a lesson from this process, that perhaps they need to dig down and look behind the headlines to work out what the consequences of the decisions they are making might be for real people who are also their constituents?
Absolutely. That is 100% the big message taken away from this. Councillors must act with their integrity. They have to do right by their own constituents, and whoever makes decisions, wherever they are in the organisation or in their own political parties, they have to listen to the people on the ground. And they cannot, there's an action and a reaction, there's an impact to every decision, and a decision taken to take away money in that way, in that very public way, was wrong. People went up in arms, and thankfully, as I say, we had a rollback. But it's really important to remember you shouldn't take from the most vulnerable. That is just not acceptable. There's a level that everybody in Northern Ireland accepts, but it's fundamentally unfair to take away from those who really have been neglected in many, many parts of life.
And there is such a thing as people power.
And there is such a thing as people power, and I'm delighted to see such people power in the last week. It's been absolutely heartening.
Thanks very much for making time to come in to talk to us after such a hectic week, and I think many people would want me to say well done, so well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Joan Henderson there from SOLAS. Let's just have a final word with Sam. It's an interesting grassroots politics that we've just seen at work, and being quite successful, actually.
I think that sometimes people in the DUP and Sinn Féin look at groups like this as an easy touch. They think they don't have power because they don't have the sort of sectarian power, which often decides our politics. And I think the fact that they lost effectively, when you look at the opening stance from the DUP and Sinn Féin on this, yes, they didn't give everything that they were initially being asked to give, but they gave a heck of a lot more than they wanted to give to this organisation. That shows the importance of transparency. This was being done behind closed doors. Ultimately, the vote was behind closed doors, and there are big questions for councillors there. But this was something that even the DUP and Sinn Féin realised they couldn't defend to the public. They had no valid explanation for what they were doing, and so they've compromised, and that's good. But it should never have got to this position.
Yeah, when this was discussed on Talkback on BBC Radio Ulster last week, the Deputy Lord Mayor, Anya Grugan, who appeared in that short film we just showed, said there are too many cases of important decisions being made in closed session without any transparency, when there's no real need for that, in her view, and that needs to be reviewed and brought to an end. The thing is, we know about how politics works within City Hall. What are the chances of that actually being addressed?
Well, I mean, some parties, to their credit, Alliance, have been quite consistent in this across Northern Ireland in saying that there needs to be more transparency in terms of council minutes, in terms of councils being recorded, etc. That was put into law by Stormont several years ago. But I think that when you look at this more broadly, this is a council that is groaning under the weight of money for all sorts of tribal projects, huge salaries for some of their staff, and here is a small group trying to help vulnerable kids, and they're taking it away from them. That's awful.
In his column in Thursday's Irish News, Newton Emerson talked about how, as he put it, the shameless sense of ownership Sinn Féin and the DUP have over the council's Neighbourhood Regeneration Fund and similar funds reflects an aggressive majoritarianism on their part. Is that it?
Well, I mean, look, that is the way politics has been set up in Northern Ireland. It's power sharing if you look at it from a positive perspective. It's carving up power if you look at it from a negative perspective. Ultimately, it's the same thing. I think the way in which that power is being used is what is concerning here. If they were using that power to say, look, this is not a sectarian issue, this is something we can agree on, we should agree on. As Joan has said, this cuts across every element of our politics, every element of our society, every part of our class system. This is something that is common to us all, but that's not the way they approached this.
Briefly and finally, it's not been a great week, I think many people would say, for Sinn Féin. We had Jerry Kelly bringing ridicule on himself and to some extent his party with his defamation case against Malachy O'Doherty, which was very publicly knocked on the head.
And what we see in this is Sinn Féin's latent authoritarianism. They wanted it to be illegal, contrary to the law, something that somebody should have to pay an awful lot of money for, to say Jerry Kelly shot a prison officer in the head. And that's not a good place to be. We need to be an open society where people can talk freely, can debate freely, can get things right, because sometimes these politicians, as we've just talked about, get things wrong. So it was very important that Master Bell struck that down rigorously as he did, and hopefully there is a new era now where we don't have this rush to the courts to try to shut down legitimate political debate in our society.
And just very briefly, what do you think the implications are for Jerry Kelly's career as an MLA?
He'll be fine. He's a massive Republican figure. It's embarrassing for him. He's going to be fine. And however he finds the money for this, he's not going to be in any great financial distress, I don't think.
OK. Sam, thanks very much indeed. Need to leave it there. That is it for this week. Both Sunday Politics